The morning began as always. I woke up early, without an alarm, as it happens on most of my days. First, the familiar sound of the coffee machine, its steady rhythm filling the house, and I, still with my eyes closed, felt safe. Mentally, I made a note of what I needed to do: check my emails, call my mom, take the dog for a walk, just like usual. I stepped out onto the balcony. The air was cold and fresh, as though it had snowed during the night, though there was no snow. All that remained from the night's silence were the solitary sounds of the street and the birds singing. I took a deep breath, letting go of the remnants of sleep and frozen thoughts. Inside me remained a shadow of vague anxiety, something I couldn't push away. It was like a premonition of something that shouldn't have happened. Jason was already at the table, absorbed in the news on his tablet. He didn't notice me standing on the balcony. I watched his calm face, how he swiped his finger across the screen. His habit, being lost in his thoughts, not distracted by me even when I was right there, had become a part of us. I understood that this didn't mean he didn't love me, but in our marriage, this barrier had been appearing more and more often, a barrier that seemed impossible to break. I returned to the kitchen and ate breakfast in silence. At the table, Jason seemed composed, but his silence was strange. It lingered, preventing the conversation from taking off. And then, as if unaware of the pause, he said, slightly pulling his gaze away from the tablet screen, "Chris is coming tomorrow." That word hung in the air like a meteorite falling into the ocean. I froze, unable to react, not even with a word, not even with a question. We hadn't spoken about his brother Chris for an entire year. And now, once again, it was as though he was returning, like an invisible threat or a mystery that Jason himself had yet to fully untangle. Jason's gaze didn't meet mine. He kept scrolling on the screen as if everything were just as it had been before. But there was something different in his voice, a crack, an invisible rift, and I felt it, even though I couldn't explain it. "We haven't talked about him in a while," I finally said, breaking the silence. "Yeah," he replied, still not looking up from the tablet. "I know." I tried to forget that word, forget Chris's face that had surfaced in my memory, but it didn't disappear. Chris arrived late, as usual. His car, the same old Jeep I remembered from the years when he and Jason had just started traveling together, rolled up the driveway, and I heard the sound of the brakes. I stood in the kitchen, subconsciously preparing to greet him. I wasn't sure if I wanted to see Chris, but I couldn't avoid it. And then he appeared at the door. Slim, with a slight smile on his lips, the kind that once could have made me smile, but now only caused a strange tension. He shook hands with Jason, exchanged a few words, and his eyes immediately slid to me. "Hey, how are you?" Chris smiled, as if nothing had changed in the year that had passed. I nodded, feeling as though time had reversed. Just yesterday we hadn't spoken, and now here he was. But something in his smile, in the way he looked at me, made me feel uncomfortable. We sat down to have dinner, and as soon as the conversation turned to Chris's travels, I felt everything around us become unnaturally stiff. He was talking about expeditions, about strange places he had visited, and stories that seemed made up just for fun. But there was an alienation in his words that he couldn't hide. Jason sat next to me, absorbed in his meal, but his gaze was fixed somewhere in the space beyond. He was listening to Chris, but he didn't believe him. It was obvious. I noticed how the tension slowly filled the air. Their conversation was like a chess game. Move by move, every word weighted, even though outwardly they maintained polite distance. I noticed Jason flinch slightly when Chris suddenly said, "Do you remember how you were always afraid of that warehouse near our house? It was funny how you couldn't pass by it without looking over your shoulder." Jason froze. I saw his hand twitch slightly as he set his fork down. He didn't respond, but I could tell those memories weren't pleasant for him. The warehouse was the place where the boys from their neighborhood believed monsters hid, and Chris smiled as he recalled those carefree childhood fears. But in Jason's eyes, I saw something else, either shame or fear. With every word Chris spoke, the tension grew. Dinner continued, but it felt like the evening would never end. All I could do was watch their faces, those moments of silence that stretched between them like an invisible wall. Finally, when we finished and Chris leaned back in his chair, I noticed how his gaze lingered on me. He smiled, and I thought that this smile wasn't just friendly. "So, you've been with him for a while, huh?" he asked casually, as if it was a matter of course. I remained silent, unsure of how to answer. What could I even say in response to such a question? The next morning, I woke up early, as always. But this time, it wasn't as easy. I could feel some invisible weight hanging in the air, and even the sun breaking through the blinds couldn't dispel that feeling. Jason had already gone to work. His morning call with a brief "I'll be late" pierced the emptiness of the house. Chris had gotten up earlier than me. I heard the sound of water running in the kitchen. He was already making coffee, preparing his breakfast. It was strange. I had expected him to wait for me, but he seemed so at home, as if he hadn't left. He poured cereal into a bowl, drank his coffee, almost glancing over his shoulder at me as I entered the kitchen. "Good morning," he said, as if there were not the slightest barrier between us. I nodded and sat at the table. His eyes didn't leave me, despite all the politeness in his voice. There was a tense lightness in his tone, a certain excessive openness that felt unnatural to me. We started talking, but my thoughts kept returning to what had happened at dinner. He talked about everything: childhood memories, the hometown, how the world had changed over the years. I listened, but my mind wandered elsewhere. "Do you remember that house we lived in?" he suddenly asked, and there was something insistent in his voice. I smiled, though I could feel that the conversation was brushing against something deeper. Remembering the old house wasn't difficult. He and Jason had grown up there, and I would visit them. The house was big, but cold. Jason and I had just started dating, and every word he spoke felt like I was a part of that space. But now, that place, those memories, seemed alien. "Of course I remember," I answered, but something inside me seemed to prick. "You probably think a lot about how everything has changed, don't you?" Chris shook his head, but his gaze was serious. He suddenly said, "Do you remember the abandoned warehouse near our house? The one you, I think, never went near alone?" I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't expected him to remember that. My childhood fears, which I thought I'd forgotten long ago, suddenly flooded back, overwhelming me. I had always been afraid of that warehouse. As a child, it seemed to hide something dark, dangerous, something I couldn't understand. "Yes, I remember," I managed to say, trying not to let the confusion show in my voice. Chris continued, ignoring my reaction. "You knew that Jason was always scared to go near it. I remember how we used to argue about who would be the first to dare to go inside." Strange, isn't it? All those old fears, they're so tied to that place. His voice was light, but it carried a hidden significance. I felt how something in the air had shifted, how the tension between us had grown. Indeed, there was something in these memories that wasn't quite what I had thought. Jason had always avoided talking about the past, and now those topics were returning, as if they had never left. I sat there, trying to focus on his words, but my thoughts kept faltering. Why was Chris bringing up these questions? Why now, when they had long been part of the past? It felt as if Chris hadn't just returned to our home, but also to the very essence of what had once seemed peaceful. We couldn't forget that warehouse, that fear that had once been so real, and now, years later, it had returned on the horizon. In the evening, when I was clearing the table, Chris stayed in the kitchen. He offered to help, though I was sure I could manage on my own. But I didn't refuse. By now, his presence had somehow become a part of my space, and I couldn't explain why I felt so tense in his company. He stood next to me, drying a plate with a towel, his movements smooth, confident, as though he were part of this house. I felt him beside me, yet at the same time, he seemed like a stranger. We weren't as familiar as I would have liked. Or maybe on the contrary, we were too familiar with those things that couldn't be spoken aloud. He wasn't in a hurry, and I continued to put the dishes in the sink, unable to find the right words to start a conversation. The silence between us grew thicker, and then, almost casually, he broke it, though there was something strange in his voice. Have you ever thought about how your life has changed? I froze. His question was so direct it was almost shocking. He said it not out of curiosity, not wanting to know, but as if it were simply a statement of fact. And there was something off-putting about it, as if he understood me better than I understood myself. What do you mean? I tried to hide my uncertainty, but my voice still sounded a little hoarse. He didn't answer immediately. He just continued drying the plate, his gaze focused on the task at hand. It was strange. It was as though his entire focus was on me, but he didn't let me feel that I mattered to him. You're doing everything right. Everything according to plan, he said, slightly delayed but with a strange tone. There was no judgment in his voice, but I felt something else. A subtle tension, hidden behind his words. I looked at him, and something tightened inside me. It wasn't a question. It was a statement that made me think. What if I really am doing everything by the plan? Living by habit, step by step, playing every role I'm supposed to? What if this stability, which I was so proud of, wasn't really real? I stayed silent. I didn't know what to say. His words carried not just calm, but also a certain threat. He wasn't asking a question. He was telling me something I hadn't yet realized myself. I continued putting the dishes away, and he, in the meantime, moved to the table and sat there with a cup of coffee. I couldn't shake the feeling that his words were following me. They weren't just a phrase, not a casual remark. I felt how they imprinted on me, leaving a mark that would stay with me for a long time. You know, he said when I came over to wash another cup, you always do everything right. And that's probably the strangest thing about our lives. Everything's right, but there's something wrong. His words stayed with me. I couldn't understand what exactly was wrong. He left, and I stood there in the kitchen thinking about what had just happened. And I couldn't forget what he had said. You always do everything right. Jason was staying late at work, and I decided to spend the day in the city. I didn't want to stay in the house, where the air was thick with those unclear thoughts I couldn't shake. Chris was home, and although I knew he wouldn't harm me, his presence still felt like a subtle threat. I went out into the city to clear my head. Walking down familiar streets, I decided not to think about him, about what he had said, about how his gaze made me feel out of place. I entered the gallery where a photography exhibition was being held. It was quiet and peaceful there, and I allowed myself to forget everything for a while. But the world wasn't as simple as it seemed. I barely paid attention to the photos, but soon I saw him. Chris. He was standing by one of the walls, carefully examining the pictures. I froze in the doorway, unsure whether I should approach. He noticed me first, and, without surprise, immediately made his way toward me. Turns out this place is quite interesting, he said, smiling. Have you been here long? I just arrived, I replied, trying not to reveal my displeasure. We started discussing the exhibition. The photos depicted empty streets, old buildings that had survived only in memory. Landscapes filled with the atmosphere of the past gave each shot a kind of hazy sadness. Chris pointed to a photo of an empty playground in an old neighborhood. I knew exactly which place he meant. The neighborhood where Jason and Chris had grown up. The neighborhood where I had spent several years. This place, I remember it. Haven't been there in a long time, said Chris, pointing at the photo. Why do you think places like that leave such a mark? I involuntarily thought about it. It was the kind of question that couldn't be answered directly. Why do old places, so empty, so forgotten, affect us so deeply? Why does the emptiness in them evoke an unending sense of pain? Maybe we're always searching in those places for what we didn't have. Maybe because they remind us of what we leave behind, I answered, unsure of my words. But I felt like I really had to say something. Otherwise, Chris would ask me something else I wouldn't be able to answer. He looked at me, and I understood that he saw through me, through my words. He knew perfectly well that this exhibition, like everything around us, was making me think about the past, about what had once been between us, between Jason and me, about how this house, this city, and perhaps this person had returned to my life. The photos are so strange, Chris continued. They don't just show a place. It's like they're speaking to us. Have you ever noticed how a photograph can make you remember something you thought you had long forgotten? I nodded, but his phrase still echoed in my mind. Why do such places leave a mark? I wanted to escape that question, but I couldn't. It was like it was a subconscious part of my life that I didn't want to acknowledge. But it was there. In the shadows, where both Chris and I and Jason's and my home once seemed so simple, and everything felt clear. When we parted ways, Chris looked at me again, but there was something in his gaze that made me stop. "You think well," he said, "but sometimes it's hard for us to accept the answers we find." I smiled, but I felt cold. Jason decided to gather his friends to take a little break from work. The house filled with voices and laughter, and I felt a little out of place. It was always like this in moments like these. I felt as if I were outside of all those conversations, lost in my own thoughts. Chris easily blended into the group. He was the center of attention, telling stories, entertaining everyone. I noticed how the women around him came to life as they listened, and he in turn maintained his confidence. When Jason stepped out for a moment, I went to the kitchen to bring some drinks. Suddenly, I heard a voice behind me. "You've organized everything well." I turned around. Chris was standing nearby, a little closer than necessary. He was looking at me with a slight smile. His presence was so overwhelming that I began to feel uneasy. "Thank you," I replied, opening the fridge. He stayed there, too long. I could feel his gaze even without looking into his eyes. The next morning, I met a friend at a cafe. We sat by the window, watching the passers-by. But in my mind, there was a completely different world. All I could hear were Chris's words. "You're doing everything right. Everything according to plan." They echoed in my head, like an unbearable sound, and I couldn't shake them. "You look a little strange," my friend said, but I couldn't respond. I waved it off, but thoughts of Chris wouldn't leave me. He kept being there, everywhere, in every thought. When I got home, I noticed him in the garden. He was fiddling with a bicycle, as if nothing had happened, as if everything was the same. As I approached, I couldn't help but ask, "Are you riding?" I asked, stopping on the porch. "Rarely," he replied, not looking up from his work. There was a pause between us, a little longer than usual. We both stayed silent, but the silence felt heavy. Chris suggested we go to the national park. Jason said he'd be late. He was called into a meeting, and at the last minute, he stayed home. So I found myself in the car with Chris, just the two of us. The drive was long, tired cities and empty fields passing by the windows, and the silence in the car felt almost tangible. Chris drove calmly, but from time to time he glanced at me. I couldn't figure out what he was trying to convey with his gaze. His eyes were too insistent, and it seemed like he was waiting for some kind of reaction. I turned away, not wanting to think about how, with each passing mile, I was drifting further from the familiar world. Soon we arrived at the park. Spacious forests, mountains in the distance, rivers and lakes. It all seemed too perfect, too quiet. We walked along the trail, and I could feel his presence beside me becoming more and more palpable with each step. I tried to focus on the beauty of nature, on the fresh air, but thoughts about what was happening between us kept creeping in. When we reached one of the viewpoints, Chris took out his camera. "I want to capture this moment," he said, aiming the camera at me. I didn't know how to react. He could have just taken a picture of the landscape, but his gaze was fixed on me. It seemed like he wasn't just photographing, he was trying to capture something more. "Why do you want to photograph me?" I asked, feeling tension start to build in my chest. Chris looked at me with a slight smile. "You're already part of this moment in a way. Sometimes we don't realize how we become part of something bigger. His words weren't just a phrase. They lingered with me, slipping into my thoughts. I looked at him, but something inside me pulled away. I felt that with every word he spoke, with every glance, I was losing more control over the situation. The photo was taken, but I felt how it changed. This day, this moment, these minutes spent with Chris, I couldn't forget them. Everything became blurry, unclear. I felt as if some invisible line had been crossed, but I still couldn't understand what exactly had changed in our lives. The day passed like any other, but something about it felt different. Jason was away on a business trip, and Chris stayed home. The silence in the house wasn't the same as usual. I sat in the living room with a book, but the words on the pages blurred, refusing to give me peace. Everything seemed so familiar, yet I could feel something inside me shifting. I tried to focus on something else, to avoid thinking about what had happened in the last few days. His words, his glances, how we had been silent together, how every look from him made me feel more vulnerable than I would have liked. In the evening, Chris passed by, stopped at the door, and without turning around said, "I'm leaving in a couple of days." Those words, said so calmly, hung in the air. I nodded, but something inside me tightened. It seemed to me that this conversation wasn't just about his departure. He wasn't talking about simply saying goodbye. He was talking about something bigger, something I couldn't understand, but that lingered in the air like an invisible threat. He left, and I was left sitting in silence. The house was still, but it was clear to me that something had changed within me with this moment, with this conversation. I couldn't go back to the way things were, even if I wanted to. I woke up in the morning to the sound of the phone ringing. It was Jason. His voice was tense, and I could feel as though he was trying to hide his worry. "Is everything okay?" he asked, but his tone wasn't the usual. "Yes, of course," I answered, trying to hide my own anxiety, but something in his question made me uneasy. I went downstairs and saw Chris in the kitchen. He was sitting silently, his phone lying on the table. The screen was flashing, an incoming message. I felt a strange sensation piercing through me, but I couldn't understand what exactly. His silence was tense, and I couldn't take my eyes off the flashing screen. "Is something wrong?" I asked, my voice sharp like a premonition. He didn't answer. He just sat there, unmoving, his eyes not meeting mine. I looked at my own phone. The message had come through. It was a photograph. Not ours, but with a clear implication. I felt something tighten in my chest. An answer wasn't necessary, but I still asked, "Did you know this was going to happen?" Chris remained silent. He didn't look at me, but I felt that he knew. All this time he had known. And something in his silence, in the way his eyes avoided mine, made me realize that I was already too late to figure out this puzzle. Time seemed to stop, and I realized that none of this was accidental. Jason came home in the evening. I heard him enter the house, his footsteps dull, almost ominous. He put his bag on the table and pulled out his phone. Everything that was happening in that moment felt like it was happening beyond my control. We stood in the room, and the air was so thick that I could feel it pressing down on me. He set his phone on the table, not looking at me, but in his gaze I read everything. He knew. I knew that he knew, even before he said it. "You knew this was going to happen," Jason said calmly, without anger, but with immense disappointment. He didn't ask for excuses, didn't try to figure anything out. It just sounded like a verdict. I couldn't say exactly what had happened, what had gone wrong, but I felt something inside me collapse. That night, when I was alone again, the house was so quiet that I could hear every breath I took. I walked through the empty rooms, and everything I saw around me was the same as before. But it wasn't the same anymore. Everything felt foreign. Chris left the next morning without saying goodbye. He left everything that could have tied him to this house and vanished, but his traces remained. I stood in that house, and the world no longer felt the same. Everything looked just as it had before. but nothing was the same anymore. After Chris left, I tried to rebuild my life. It seemed that everything should return to its usual rhythm, but every detail in the house reminded me of what had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was left unsaid, unfinished. Jason went back to his usual work, but a distance had formed between us, one that couldn't be bridged. We could no longer simply sit at the table, drink our morning coffee, and discuss the plans for the day. I saw questions in his eyes that I couldn't answer, and he in turn didn't try to press me for answers. One of those endless nights when I sat alone in the living room, I realized that I couldn't keep going like this. I had to find the answers, figure out what had happened. I couldn't continue living without knowing the whole truth. The next day, I decided to call Chris. My heart was racing as I dialed his number, but I still pressed the call button. He answered almost immediately. "You left, but I can't keep going like this," I said. "You need to explain to me what happened." There was a long pause on the phone, but soon his voice came through. "I knew you would call. You've always tried to figure out everything that seemed wrong, but there are things you won't want to understand." I felt his words penetrating me, but I didn't understand what exactly he meant. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying not to let my emotions take over. "You realized too late what had happened, and maybe that's for the best. Sometimes people need to go through pain to see what really matters." His words were cryptic, but there was something in them that made me doubt everything I had ever known about my marriage, about my past. We talked a little more, but eventually he said, "Everything that was between us will stay in the past. You need to move on." He hung up, and I was left standing in silence. This conversation, despite its mystery, became a turning point for me. I couldn't go back to the world that existed before Chris, but perhaps I needed to simply let go of the past and keep moving forward, despite all the questions that remained unanswered. Several weeks passed since the day I spoke to Chris. With each passing day, I tried to find my place in this new world, one that no longer offered the familiar answers I had been searching for. Jason and I continued living under the same roof, but something between us had changed. We both felt that something was no longer right, but neither of us could acknowledge it aloud. I started spending more time outside, walking through familiar places. In the city, amid the bustling streets and the smell of coffee, I tried to forget the empty feeling that had become more persistent with each day. But it still wouldn't let go of me. One day, I sat in the park, watching people walk by. And then it hit me. I could no longer be the person I had been before. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay, that nothing had left a mark on my life. I felt something changing inside me. Pain, disappointment, doubts. They were a part of me, and I couldn't ignore them. But I also realized that I couldn't continue living in the past. It was inevitable. Chris had gone, and life was moving on. All that remained was to look for new paths, new opportunities. I began to notice that the world around me once again had a place for happiness, for change. It wasn't easy, but I felt ready to begin anew. I returned home to Jason. He was still in his comfort zone, but he too seemed to feel that something needed to change. We didn't discuss what had happened, but in his eyes, I saw the same question I had been asking myself. Is this still possible? Can we ever get it back? We sat in silence at dinner, but I no longer sought an answer. I knew that what mattered now was taking a step into the unknown. Not for myself, not for others. It was my step. A step into a future where there would be room for me. The silence in the house was no longer oppressive. I felt it gradually being replaced by something new. Perhaps Jason and I would find the path we had lost. But if not, I would be ready to move on, alone. With each passing day, I was learning to let go, to forgive, to be honest with myself. And though the path ahead was still uncertain, I knew one thing. I could no longer be who I once was. And that was the beginning of something new. A few more months passed. The silence in the house gradually became less painful, but Jason and I continued to exist side by side, like two people who had forgotten how to be together. I felt we were at a crossroads, and although we didn't say it aloud, we both understood that change was inevitable. We tried to return to the old routine, but something kept us from doing so. Our conversations became more and more superficial. Sometimes I wondered why we were still together. There were no answers. But one evening, as we sat in the living room, I felt that this moment couldn't last forever. "We missed something, didn't we?" Jason said, looking at me. His words weren't an accusation, but rather an acknowledgement. I nodded, feeling the weight in my chest begin to lift. We both saw how everything had changed, but neither of us wanted to be the first to admit it. "Yes," I replied quietly. "We missed a lot." He sighed but didn't say anything in response. We just sat in silence, and I felt how this moment had become significant. It was like saying goodbye to something that could never return. Later, I decided that it was time to change something in my life. I signed up for a photography course. It was something I had wanted to do for a long time but had always postponed. I started traveling, even if only for the weekends, to feel free. I wasn't looking for answers or explanations in every step, but I could feel how the world around me was becoming brighter, more alive. Jason noticed the changes. Sometimes his gaze softened, and at times he still tried to bring us back to old habits. But I could no longer return to that life. I was ready to move forward. One day I came home late, and as I passed by the window, I noticed Jason sitting in the chair, flipping through old photographs. He was absorbed in his memories. I didn't approach him, but I looked at his face. His eyes were filled with unspoken thoughts. It was strange. He was still searching for answers in the past that I had already left behind.